The Godfather, eh? That wasn't any kind of ethnic slur of him? Okay. Very happy to be here and to start off this week, which I think that you really will find quite enjoyable. I've spoken to a number of people, and it turns out there are a lot of people who are here for the first time. So if you're a newbie, don't worry about it. There are a lot of people in your situation, and anyway, there are a lot of people here who are also quite friendly. The faculty, I'll tell you, with the exception of myself, is very accessible. Really, there are people, people on the faculty, they haven't taught college as long as I have probably, who actually enjoy speaking with students. So so if you have any questions, anything you'd like to bring up, we're going to be having our meals with you guys, which certainly is going to be a high point of my week. I actually haven't eaten with plastic utensils since I was in a high chair, actually. But the point is that we're going to be available at mealtime, and there's going to be a social hour when eligible people can have wine and beer and so on. So plenty of time to approach faculty with anything that's on your mind, any question you'd like to bring up. I have really quite a responsibility tonight, speaking about the life and achievement of Ludwig von Mises, and I'll try to indicate in my talk why there even is an institute named after him. But let me start by pointing this out. Many years ago, William F. Buckley Jr., when he started his career of debating liberal leftist professors at colleges, and often he would start by putting two names on the board, on the blackboard. One would be the name of somebody, John Dewey maybe, or John Kenneth Galbraith, and asked how many people have heard of this man, and almost everybody had heard of him, college students. And then he put on the board the name of Ludwig von Mises, and he said, how many people have heard of him? And no one, or virtually no one, ever raised his hand. Now, needless to say, the situation has not improved that much since those far gone days, except in the sense that almost everybody's heard of Buckley. I mean, if you consider that some big compensation. But this is an anomalous thing. This is a strange thing if you think about it. Even the New York Times, when Mises died in October 1973, called Mises one of the foremost economists of this century. And Milton Friedman, who comes from a totally different tradition, referred to Mises as one of the great economists of all time. A nice, gracious tribute, I think. But there was even more to Mises, a lot more to Mises than being an economist, as great an economist as he was. By the mid-20th century, Mises was famous among knowledgeable people who knew what they were talking about, as the great representative of a school of thought that could be said to have a certain historical importance, a certain intellectual respectability, the school of thought that includes David Hume, Adam Smith, Turgot, Wilhelm von Humboldt, Benjamin Constant, Alexis de Tocqueville, Lord Acton, Karl Menger, Eugen von Bernbovert, William Graham Sumner, Herbert Spencer, Vilfredo Pareto, and many others. And Mises was recognized as the great representative in his day of this school of thought, which we call nowadays classical liberalism. And you might have thought on that basis alone that the academic establishment would find a place for him in the pluralistic setting of American academic life to present some of his ideas to the students, but that never happened. Now, through some methods and some means that I'll talk about later on, belatedly, many more people, I think, are coming to know of him. Now, there are people present in our faculty who could speak of Mises' scientific achievements with much greater background than I can. His first great contribution, I think, was in connection with the theory of money and with the business cycle, and Professor Salerno certainly could tell you about that, as well as other people in the audience among our faculty. Maybe his greatest scientific achievement was systematizing all of economic thought in his great work, Human Action, starting from basic axioms and through this axiomatic derivation of economic truths, presenting economics as a total system, something that had not been done in a long time. But to my mind, one of his great achievements has to do with the question of central economic planning, which at one time was very strongly brooded about. Quite possibly, and Mises played the key role in this whole big debate. Quite possibly the great intellectual scandal, still unadmitted, of the past century has been that the vast international Marxian movement, including thousands upon thousands of professional thinkers in all fields, was for generations content to discuss the whole issue of capitalism versus socialism solely in terms of the alleged defects of capitalism. The question of how and how well a socialist economy would function was avoided as taboo. Taboo in the anthropological sense of some sacred object or some sacred idea, some sacred concept that could not be approached, could not be touched. It was Mises' accomplishment and a sign of his superb independence of mind to have simply brushed aside this pious, one simply does not speak of such things, and to have presented comprehensively and arrestingly the problem inherent in attempting rational economic calculation in a situation where no market exists for production goods. I mean, basically what he said is, yes, we know that capitalism causes all of these evils, evils upon evils. It causes the breakdown of the family, and also the imprisonment of women within the family. It causes poverty, and it causes disgusting overconsumption, and in many cases, it causes depressions. It causes inflations, and on and on. And everything that was wrong with the world was due to capitalism. And Mises said, well, let's leave that aside. We can discuss that another time. Would you gentlemen kindly indicate to me how rational economic planning is possible in the absence of prices for capital goods? Simple question, let's just focus on that. And what Mises got at was the fundamental structural problem with socialist economies that plagued them for decade after decade, for 70 years in the Soviet Union, and which finally brought about the end of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not brought about by some increase in the American defense budget that finally bankrupted them. It was eroded through the decades by the fact that they simply could not produce anything. Some of you may have been to Russia, well, you kind of, not now, but in the old days when there was still communism. I was there under Gorbachev at a conference, a Cato conference for a few days, and it was simply incredible what they were. In Gum's department store, they're Bloomingdale's, across the street from the Kremlin. The sort of stuff that you might pick up, and maybe you did pick up as an undergraduate student at Goodwill, to clothe yourself and so on. Anyway, and with the information revolution, everybody in Russia began to realize this. Everybody knew it, that socialism was an economic failure. God forbid that it had been an economic success. I mean, in other words, if they could boast that they were actually economically successful, and so we had to put up with the KGB, we had to put up with, Lubyanka and the Gulag and so on, because they produced so much, then we would have been in trouble. But they couldn't fulfill their promise. And this slogan that you saw all over communist countries, they used to put up big slogans all the time to rouse the people. Communism, the radiant future of all mankind, became just totally hollow. Nobody could believe it anymore. Just as before the French Revolution, before the Russian Revolution of 1917, people simply could not believe in the legitimacy of the regime anymore. What I'm getting at is that in 1922, Mises had pointed out why that was going to be inherent in socialism. And for years afterwards, I mean, Hans or somebody can tell us the date of whatever Samuelson's economics textbook is, where he says that soon the Soviet Union is going to be on a par with the United States in production. Or Galbraith had the nerve in an article in a magazine just around about this time to say that there are actually advantages to socialist economy, because in a socialist economy everybody has to work. Getting back to the dumbest kind of statement by Fourier or the Saint-Simonians, that since you don't have bankers, you don't have financiers, you don't have capitalists, you don't have merchants, everybody actually has to carry things, then that economy has to be a lot more productive. So these people who are so celebrated kept on, and Mises, as I say, pointed it out. In German, the book came out in 1922, and you can get a nice edition of it from Liberty Press with an introduction by Hayek. And Hayek says that when it came out, Hayek had just gotten out of the Austrian army. The war was just over, and Hayek says that he was a starry-eyed. Starry-eyed. He was a socialist, idealistic socialist. Hard to imagine Hayek's, sort of dwelling on things like people, not profits, and thinking that was really the foundation of economic wisdom. But nonetheless, he tended towards socialism, and he said, Mises converted me. Mises' book Socialism converted me. Mises' book Socialism converted an Englishman by the name of Lionel Robbins, who then started a free market tradition at the London School, converted a German by the name of Wilhelm Röpke, who was a major economist behind Erhardt's great revival of the German economy, converted a lot of people. So that Mises already had an impact back then. Given Mises' accomplishments, and I'm going to add some others as well, how can we account for the fact that the academic establishment could take Harold, I don't know if you even know these names, Harold Lasky or Thorstein Veblen seriously, Walter Lippmann as a social philosopher, not to mention Galbraith, and they could not bring themselves to familiarize their students with Mises. The establishment for all these decades lionized men like Raymond Aron. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was supposed to be one of the great social philosophers of the age, very banal writer and thinker as far as I'm concerned, Keynesian, a man who took Keynesianism as given. Supposed to have been, he was an original member of the Mont Pelerin Society, I guess because he was an actual communist agent, but soon left since he wasn't among friends. Or the establishment also lionized people like Isaiah Berlin, Sir Isaiah Berlin, if you don't mind, who was basically a high-level popularizer of ideas. But Mises never received the kind of recognition that was his due. At NYU, what was the meaning of that? At the Mises Institute, we're all friends, we're very closely knit together, but on the other hand, You got to just watch out. Now, Mises taught at NYU, and George later in the week is going to be telling in detail about that NYU seminar. But NYU would not even pay his salary, and he had some kind of adjunct position. Salary was paid by an outside independent foundation. And he only had a handful of Ph.D. students, because other professors obviously would not recommend that anybody get a Ph.D. under Mises. Just a handful of students. Among them, however, was Hans Zenholz, Israel Kirzner, and George Reisman, which maybe makes up for a lot. He was never elected president of the American Economic Association, as Schumpeter was, for instance. So all of this requires some explanation. I mean, on the one hand, we have his scientific achievements recognized widely. On the other hand, we have this suppression of Mises. And I think that a large part of the explanation has to do with what one of his friends, a French economist, Jacques Rueff, who was a great economist in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in France, refers to as Mises's intransigence. There's a great Festschrift, you know, a book of writings in celebration of Mises, I think, 50th, the anniversary of 50th receipt of his Ph.D. And I don't know if it's still available, but surely you could find it somewhere. Anyway, it consists of a lot of very interesting articles about Mises personally, also contributions, as Murray's contribution is not correct, on welfare economics is in there. And Jacques Rueff, who knew Mises for many years, talks about Mises and his intransigence, meaning what? That he was, in fact, a relentless, implacable fighter for his doctrine. If you think about it, I mean, some of us have known Mises. You guys will never know him, although there's a real nice collection of photos down in one of these halls here in different positions and so on. You see how expressive he was. Bettina Graves, or Bettina Bien as she was at the time, took these photographs. For over 6 decades he was at war with the whole spirit of his age, and with every one of the advancing victorious or modish political schools, right and left. Decade after decade he fought against militarism, protectionism, inflationism, every variety of socialism, and every policy of the interventionist state. And through most of that time, he stood alone, or close to it. The totality and enduring intensity of Mises's battle could only be fueled from a profound inner sense of the truth and supreme value of the ideas for which he was struggling. This is the central point. Very possibly his temperament as well helped produce a certain attitude that people interpreted as his arrogance. An arrogance in his tone, or an apodictic quality, as some of us in the Mises seminar fondly called it, using one of his own favorite words. This attitude of his, which I never experienced personally, I always found him totally open to any question or objection. In any case, what some people found to be his arrogant attitude was the last thing that academic left liberals and social democrats could accept in a defender of a point of view they considered only marginally worthy of toleration to begin with. If he had seemed defensive and cowed, there would have been more acceptable. But Mises was the opposite of that. And Mises, let's say outspokenness, would largely account, I think, for the greater recognition that has been accorded to Friedrich Hayek. I'll talk about Hayek more tomorrow. Even before Hayek won the Nobel Prize back 25 years ago, 30 years ago. Hayek was temperamentally much more moderate in expression than Mises ever was. Hayek declined, rejected the use of the term laissez-faire, for instance. Mises reveled in it. To take an exemplary case, Hayek dedicated The Road to Serfdom to socialists of all parties. Now, you can't imagine Mises doing something like that. It would be like Ayn Rand dedicating Atlas Shrugged to thugs of all descriptions. But this lack of recognition, and George will tell you the same thing, anybody who was at the seminar will tell you the same thing, did not faze Mises at all, not in the least. He continued his work decade after decade. And I want to point out one thing that is maybe not understood that well. And that is, of course, he was a great economist, a great social philosopher, but he also studied history extensively and very deeply. He was very concerned with history. And he wrote a book on methodology that had to do with the methodology of theory and history, but also in regard to specific historical events and historical developments. And my own opinion is that he had the tendency to go to the heart of the matter when others just sort of floundered around or maybe lost themselves in a lot of detail and verbiage. Take two examples. There's a whole question of the Industrial Revolution. And as you probably know, that's a great, or has been one of the great arguments against laissez-faire capitalism, this idea that at one time we had laissez-faire capitalism. What happened? Everything happened. Everything rotten happened. Women started to work for the first time, by the way. Ladies, the women here would be interested to know that. It was only starting in the end of the 18th century that women started doing any work. Children worked. There were slums. People were poor. People died. Every possible plague. Now, what Mises says is that you cannot understand the Industrial Revolution without understanding the fact that the Western world was undergoing a population explosion, an unprecedented population explosion. Demographers are not sure the reason for that, but there's no doubt about the statistics, about the facts of the matter. Population explosion, in fact, was all across Eurasia, also in China, India. But especially the population of England, to take one example, was about, in 1750, was about 6 million. By 1850, the population, it was 24 million. That population of 6 million in 1750 was the highest it had ever been. And then steadily, over the decades, the population exploded, the same with most European countries. And the question was, how were these new tens and tens of millions of people going to live? How are they going to survive? And Mises said the Industrial Revolution was the answer to this problem of the population explosion. That's how they survived, by society becoming immensely more productive. Okay? And this is, there's a very good, useful book called How the West Grew Rich, by Nathan Rosenberg and L.E. Birdsell, How the West Grew Rich. I'm sure it's in the library here. Every library has it anyway. And look up the pages on the Industrial Revolution. This book is the result of the new institutional economics, application of neoclassical economics to economic history and so on. This is exactly what they say, that the Industrial Revolution was not the problem, it was the solution. Okay? Which is also, by the way, what Ayn Rand says. The fact of the matter is, she's, in that regard, turns out to be a better historian than probably most of the people who have taught you, because that's the truth of the matter. And so my point is that Mises was able to see that, and Mises unraveled the problem of the Industrial Revolution. Or take another example. This is something Mises says in one of his essays. What's the difference between East and West? Why did the East stagnate? Why did the West progress? And he said, the idea of liberty is and always has been peculiar to the West. The East liked the primordial thing, the idea of freedom from the state. It never called into question the arbitrariness of the despots. And first of all, it never established the legal framework that would protect the private citizen's wealth against confiscation on the part of tyrants. Okay? What I propose to you is what you have here in a nutshell is the kernel of this whole idea that goes by the name of the European miracle. And there's an enormous literature now. Douglas North won a Nobel Prize for writing on this and other similar subjects. And many people could be, many economic historians and economists could be mentioned. Why was Europe different? Why was there this European miracle? And the basic reason was that there was and I'll talk about this probably more later in the week, there was a curtailment of the predatory taxing and extortionate power of the state. In other great civilizations, they are great civilizations, culturally speaking and so on, you never had this kind of curtailment of the despot's power. I get the sense that you're not too familiar with this, but I'll talk more about it in the week. In the West, what happened was that there were assemblies, representative assemblies, parliaments, and so on, by the way, of the property-owning classes, not of everybody, who then could, as they do nowadays, turn around and vote the redistribution of income to themselves. No, these were people who were concerned with the right to property. There were such assemblies, there were bills of rights, Magna Carta is an example. There was the idea of natural law, and many other things that were unique to the West, that produced something that princes, the generic term for rulers, really were not very comfortable with. It limited their power. They loved the idea of being able to tax people to death, or tax them to the very point where they almost, some kind of malicious Laffer curve, where they almost died. They were still basically alive, but they could tax everything else away, or simply expropriated their property, as they often did in other civilizations. In the West, there were limits to the power of the ruler over the property of their citizens. And nowadays I take it not for this group, but if you talk to maybe some of your fellow students, you say that this guy is very rich. First thing that will occur to them is, well, let's take his money away from him and give it to the needy. Well, if that had happened, if that had been the history of the West, then, as Camille Paglia said in another respect, we'd still be living in grass huts. The reason that the West turned out to be different was that there were established and guaranteed property rights. And productive people could accumulate property, could invest it, could increase the productivity of labor, and steadily, in some places faster than others. In Holland, became a very good example, in England also, and in the American colonies. This protection of property rights led to this miracle, as E.L. Jones calls it, which was that for the first time the human race escaped the Malthusian trap. And there was a sustained per capita increase in productivity that finally has produced our modern world. Well, to get back to Mises, what I'm saying is that Mises had this insight, that it was a question of limiting the arbitrary power of the ruler. That made the difference between East and West. And as I say, there's a huge literature nowadays that supports that. I think that at the end of the conference, our email addresses will be distributed if they haven't been distributed yet, So if you have any questions about bibliography or anything you'd like to find out about any of my lectures, or imagine any of the other instructors' lectures, feel free. Please keep in mind that I know enough about computers to know that email messages can be traced. So it's not going to. So if you have some bona fide question or bibliography that you want to find out about, you can email me. So this was a bit of an aside. This business about history. Mises' main concern, obviously, was economics. He continued to work decade after decade, accumulating contributions to economic theory, developing the theoretical structure of the Austrian school. And you can read about this in many places, including Murray Rothbard's very lucid, intelligent little book, The Essential for Mises. And from his understanding of the laws of economic activity, elaborating, correcting, and bringing up to date the great social philosophy of classical liberalism. Now, before I leave the subject totally, I want to say something about this idea which maybe you're going to find elsewhere about Mises' so-called intolerance. I'm sorry to say that Milton Friedman seems to be the main fomenter of this idea. I have a good deal of respect for Milton Friedman. A few years ago at the Montpellier meeting in London, maybe you've probably heard about this organization. Anyway, they trotted out their 5 or 6 mainly right-center Nobel laureates to give some kind of a little pep talk. Friedman wasn't there, so his talk was recorded. And this was a couple of years ago. But this war on terror had begun already. But the main weight of his remarks, unlike the other men, Buchanan and the others, was that we have to watch out that war is the great enemy of liberty. And this war on terror promises perhaps to be a great danger to civil liberties. And a few weeks ago he reiterated that in some interview. So what I'm saying is that Friedman is a person whose heart is in the right place when it comes to something like this. But as I say, but Friedman spreads this thing about then the story that Lou dealt with in in one of his talks on Mises, about how Mises was at one meeting talking to a bunch of people. It was Friedman, there was Hayek, there was John Jukes, who was an economist at the time, some others, and they were discussing taxation, and then finally Mises stamped away saying, you're all a bunch of socialists. Why would Mises say something like that? Well, obviously he was prone to episodes of psychotic behavior. Or it's very possible, to my mind it's likely, that they started talking about taxation as a method of redistributing wealth, or taxation as an instrument of social justice, which is not impossible given the people who were there. Seems to me very likely. But in any case, so a few years ago, so this was a number of years ago, it was at Stanford, and IHS had set up some conference on the welfare state, and there was Friedman, and there was myself, there were a couple of other people. I got off a good opening line since the place was packed, and I said, well, I knew that I had some followers in the East, but this is very gratifying. Obviously, they'd all come to hear Friedman, right? But the point is that Friedman repeated this story about Mises. And I asked Friedman afterwards, why did you do that? Almost nobody there had ever heard of Mises before. Why should you be introducing him to them in this way? And he had no answer for it. But let's try to figure out what he's getting at. And it turns out that he wrote some popular article, Friedman did, where he talks about this. And he says that This basic intolerance of Mises, alleged intolerance, is due to his methodological doctrine of praxeology. Mises' fundamental idea was that we know things about human action, in quotes, because we are human beings. As a result, he argued, we have absolutely certain knowledge of the motivations of human actions, the motivations of human actions, as if Mises says anything like that. And Mises maintained that we can derive substantive conclusions from that basic knowledge. Facts, statistical or other evidence cannot, Mises argued, be used to test these conclusions. That philosophy, according to, this is Friedman talking, that philosophy converts an asserted body of substantive conclusions into a religion. Suppose two people who share from Mises' praxeological view come to contradictory conclusions about anything. How can they reconcile their differences? The only way they can do this is by a purely logical argument. One has to say to the other, you made a mistake in reasoning. The other has to say, no, you made a mistake in reasoning. Supposing neither believes he had made a mistake in reasoning, there's only one thing left to do, to fight. I could give you the source of this, but it's unbelievable that this should come from someone like Milton Friedman, because among other things, this theory of his predicts the occurrence of incessant bloody brawling among mathematicians and logicians, right? Since they disagree about reasoning, all they can do is kick each other, and the non-occurrence of these bloody brawls falsifies Friedman's theory in his own positivist terms. Friedman's position also entails that no religious person who felt certain about his religious beliefs could have any principled reason to respect the conflicting religious beliefs of others, which is absurd. And finally, Friedman's proposed explanation of Mises' alleged intolerance fails to account for the personal tolerance of other practitioners of Mises' a priori method. I mean, supposing even that that's the case with Mises, it's obviously not the case with Kerzner and with a lot of other people. So I don't know. I can't imagine what's behind all of this on the part of Friedman. I don't think he bothers to keep saying this anymore, though. Okay, now, so Mises kept refining and elaborating on Austrian economics, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the most powerful tool we have for analyzing social reality, and elaborating and bringing up to date the classical liberal tradition. But within this classical liberal tradition, distinctions may be drawn. You can distinguish between conservative and radical liberals. Mises belonged to the second category, and on this basis he could be contrasted, for instance, to Macaulay, Alexis de Tocqueville, Ortega Gasset, and other classical liberals who were more conservative. To take an example from Tocqueville's Democracy in America, Tocqueville at one point cries out, "Nothing conceivable is so petty, so insipid, so crowded with paltry interests, in a word, so anti-poetic as the life of a man in the United States." Now Mises, by the way, was not heavily into what we call popular culture. And if you were around today, I think it's safe to say that he would be even less into popular culture. Okay, his idea of art, and he says in Human Actions, talking about rationality in art also, a Mozart symphony. As an Austrian, of course, it has to be Mozart. But Mises never gave any indication that he cared much for mass culture of his own time. But that was not the point. He had his own standards. He thought that they were, and in fact, they pretty clearly elevated and refined standards. But the mass of people had their right to their own life and their own standards. He says, for instance, the addiction to narcotic drugs like heroin and cocaine is obviously a very dangerous and destructive thing, but it is part of the right to consume what you want that all mature adults have, all reasonable, rational adults have. You don't stop them from doing something destructive by taking drugs, just as you wouldn't stop them from doing something like destructive, like reading terrible, subversive things like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, for instance. There's an obvious slippery slope there. So the point is, Mises is not. I can't imagine anybody less likely to take drugs than Mises. Mises is not endorsing drugs. He's endorsing the right of average people, of the masses, if you want, to take to their own system of values. And very typical. Mises was very pro-American, that is, pro-American society and American civilization, rather than pro-British, as Hayek was. Mises was a radical liberal, and all of the elements of radical liberalism are there. His uncompromising rationalism, reiterated again and again. His emphasis is focusing on the all importance of human welfare, as human welfare, the welfare of human beings, not of society, not social welfare, but human welfare as men and women individually define it for themselves. He was a champion of peace in the tradition of the 19th century liberals, most closely associated with laissez-faire, and peace he bases on the substructure of free trade. And it's hard to put this without inviting misunderstandings. He was a believer in equality, not inequality of talents. It's the market that decides that one person is going to be an orchestra leader, somebody else is going to sweep the floors in the orchestra hall. Certainly not equality of income, but inequality of, let's say, respect for people. Respect for people, their own personal systems of value, their own development, and in supporting the social system that has done has done everything to promote human welfare and the good of individuals in that way. When he spoke about equality, he never had in mind any kind of future fantasy utopia where each will absolutely count for one, none more than one, but rather the empirical conditions under which human beings have because he knew tremendous amount about the scope of history. Human beings have hitherto found themselves in various societies. What have actually been the conditions of class, status, degree, and privilege in the history of mankind, and what difference has capitalism made? The history of pre-capitalist societies is the history of slavery, serfdom, caste and class privileges in the most degrading forms. It is history made by slave owners, warrior nobles, even by eunuch makers, by kings, by their mistresses and courtiers, by state-sponsored priests and other Mandarin intellectuals. History made by parasites and oppressors of all descriptions. Capitalism shifts the whole center of gravity of society. As Lord Cornwallis's troops played at Yorktown when the British Army is surrendering, the world turned upside down. The world turned upside down. In the enormously important statement, every dollar, whether in the possession of someone totally lacking in the social graces, no one here need be mentioned, of someone of mean birth, of a Jew, of a black, of someone no one even ever heard of, every one of their dollars is the equal of every other dollar and commands products and services on the market which talented people must structure their whole lives to provide. Capitalism is mass production, which means production for the masses. The masses are the ones who are ultimately in control. Mises maintained that the pseudo-revolution, which socialism would bring about, is much more likely to lead to the reemergence of a society of status and the re-degradation of the masses to the position of pawns controlled by an elite which would assign to itself the title role in the heroic melodrama, man consciously makes his own history. Now Mises, I'll be talking more about Mises tomorrow night, and George certainly will talk about Mises. And what is the long night of the soul? Is that the phrase when sort of symbolically up at 4 o'clock in the morning and start thinking? And this despair that Mises fell into at a certain point in his life and what he did about it. But then he began to make a difference. By the way, Erich Streissler, this Austrian economist whom I don't really think very highly of, does make the important point that when British classical political economy collapsed after John Stuart Mill and also with Marshall and so on, it was a broken crutch, broken reed for the free enterprise system. It was the Austrians that took it up and kept it going. And Mises is the key to that. And then when Mises in the U.S. Exerted a certain impact, this happened through the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington, FEE as we call it, Irvington-on-Hudson, which is still in existence. Leonard Read, the founder, was converted to Mises as their main spokesman. Mises had a great personal impact on Henry Hazlitt, who was a prominent economic journalist at the time, Murray Rothbard and others, and also mentioned Ayn Rand before. And Ayn herself promoted Mises' economic writings. She never cared for Hayek very much, and in this way, this influenced various objectivist groups. So he did have something of an impact, and I don't think that in the end he was despairing. But give me a couple of minutes, and I want to say that no appreciation of Mises would be complete without saying something inadequate about the man and the individual. Mises' immense scholarship, bringing to mind other German-speaking scholars like Max Weber and Joseph Schumpeter, who seemed to work on the principle that someday all encyclopedias might very well just vanish from the shelves, so that they had to have all of this in their own minds. The Cartesian clarity of his presentations in class, it takes a master to present a complex subject simply. His respect for the life of reason, evident in every gesture and glance, his courtesy and kindliness and understanding, even to beginners, his real wit, of the sort proverbially bred in the great cities, akin to that of Berliners, of Parisians and New Yorkers, only Viennese and softer. Let me just say that having at an early point come to know the great Mises has tended to create in my mind lifelong standards to which other scholars who one encounters will not be able to stand up to. And I'm talking about Chicago and other places. But there's no comparison there. You're talking about two different sorts of human beings. So it was altogether fitting when Mises died for Murray Rothbard to write an obituary where he quoted the lines from a poem by Shelley, the British poet Shelley, Adonais, where Shelley wrote about the death of his friend John Keats. And Murray quoted this in regard to Mises. For such as he can lend, they borrow not glory from those who made the world their prey. And he has gathered to the kings of thought, who waged contention with their time's decay, and of the past are all that cannot pass away. And this is one of the purposes, one of the reasons for being of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, to perpetuate and develop the ideas of this very great thinker of the 20th century, unduly neglected in his own time, but maybe his time will come. Thank you.